It is 10:15 in the evening, and the President of the United States is laughing. The joke is not even a particularly good one, a line about manners and heiresses that the actor on stage has delivered 100 times before, in 100 other cities, to 100 other audiences who found it only mildly funny. But tonight, the laughter comes easily rolling through the packed house of Ford's Theatre like something physical, because tonight everyone in the building has more to laugh about than the play in front of them. The war that has consumed this country for 4 years, that has filled its rivers with the dead and its newspapers with casualty lists longer than any war in the nation's short history, is over. 5 days ago, a Confederate general surrendered an army in a small Virginia courthouse, and the president, 16th in the line, the man who carried the weight of the whole bloody business on his narrow shoulders for half a decade, has, for one evening, allowed himself to feel something close to peace. He sits in a flag-draped box above the stage, his wife beside him, 2 young guests beside her. He leans forward slightly to watch the scene. He laughs. He does not see the man standing in the narrow passage outside the box door, a door that should be guarded, and is not, because the guard assigned to watch it grew bored sometime in the last hour and wandered off to a tavern next door for a beer. He does not hear footsteps. He does not feel the presence of another human being closing the distance behind him, a man he has actually met before, whose face he has watched from this very theatre on a different night 2 years earlier. A celebrated actor whose politics have curdled over 4 years of war into something closer to religious conviction. In a few seconds, the man behind him will press a small pistol to the back of his head and pull the trigger. But we are not there yet. We are 20 hours earlier in a different room entirely, where the President of the United States is describing a dream to the 7 men sitting around his cabinet table. A dream, he tells them, of a strange and indescribable vessel moving with great speed toward a dark and indefinite shore. He has had this dream before, he says. He had it before Antietam, before Gettysburg, before every great turn the war has taken. He does not yet know what it means this time. Part 1. A Nation on the Mend. The morning of April the 14th, 1865, arrives in Washington the way mornings had not arrived in this city for 4 years, without the particular dread that had hung over the capital since the first shots at Fort Sumter, without the daily anxiety of casualty lists and troop movements, and the gnawing uncertainty of whether the Republic itself would survive the year. It is Good Friday. The cherry trees along the unfinished mall are beginning to bloom, and somewhere in the city, soldiers who 5 days ago had every reason to expect they might die in Virginia are instead waking up to the strange, disorienting experience of a war that has simply stopped. Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April, and the news reached Washington the following day, and the city had erupted not in the relieved, exhausted way that news of victory sometimes arrives, but in something closer to delirium. Crowds had gathered outside the White House 2 nights running, demanding a speech, and the president had obliged, standing at an upstairs window with a candle held by his young son Tad, to read his remarks by, talking already about the difficult, unglamorous work of bringing the South back into the Union rather than punishing it for having left. This morning, the 14th, he has slept better than he has slept in months. His private secretary will later say that he looked, for the first time in a long while, like a man whose face had been allowed to rest. He eats a light breakfast, an egg, a cup of coffee, with his eldest son Robert, who has just returned from Virginia, where he served on General Grant's staff and witnessed the surrender firsthand. The president asks him to describe it. Robert obliges, telling his father about Lee's appearance, about the quiet dignity of the Confederate general's surrender, about Grant's decision to let the defeated soldiers keep their horses and their personal sidearms, a mercy that the president, when he hears of it, approves of completely. He has said for weeks now that he wants no one hanged, no one humiliated. Let them up easy. He has told his generals, let them up easy. At 11 o'clock, the cabinet assembles in the room they have occupied through 4 years of the worst crisis the nation has ever faced. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, Attorney General James Speed, and several others, along with General Ulysses S. Grant himself, fresh from Appomattox and seated as a guest of honor. The agenda is, for once, not a military one. The president wants to talk about what comes next, the complicated, unglamorous architecture of reunion. How does a nation that has just spent 4 years killing its own citizens over the question of secession go about welcoming the seceded states back? What happens to the millions of newly freed men and women whose status the war has settled in principle but not in any practical detail? He speaks, according to those present, with an unusual gentleness about the defeated South. He does not want a bloodbath of retribution. He wants, he tells them, malice toward none. It is in this meeting, before the practical business begins, that he tells them about the dream. He describes it the way a man describes something that has genuinely unsettled him, even if he is doing his best to sound light-hearted about it. A vessel of indescribable design, moving across dark water with tremendous speed, toward a shore he cannot quite make out. He has had the dream, he says, before nearly every great and decisive moment of the war, before Antietam, before Stone River, before Gettysburg, before Vicksburg. Each time something significant followed. Wells will later write that the president seemed genuinely moved by the recollection, and that several of the men in the room, practical, unsentimental men who have spent 4 years drowning in logistics and casualty figures, found themselves quiet for a moment, turning the dream over in their minds without quite knowing what to make of it. Grant, when his turn comes to speak, raises a different and more immediate concern. Joseph Johnston's Confederate Army is still in the field in North Carolina, and Grant expects momentous news from that front any day, the second great surrender that will finally and completely end the rebellion. The president listens to this with evident pleasure. He has waited 4 years for sentences like these. After the cabinet meeting, the president returns briefly to other business, pardons to review, a commission to approve, the unglamorous daily paperwork of running a country, even on the best of days. But something in his mood has lightened further as the day goes on. Mary Lincoln, who has watched her husband move through years of visible strain, who has buried one son already to illness and feared more than once for her husband's health under the weight of the office, notices the change and remarks on it. He tells her, with what she will later describe as an almost boyish brightness, that he intends to be happier in the years that remain to them, that the war is ending, that they are both still young enough, relatively speaking, to enjoy what comes after. He talks about a trip west when his term is finished. California, perhaps, the Holy Land, ordinary plans, the kind a man makes when he has finally allowed himself to believe in a future. Mary, by her own later account, finds something almost unsettling in how happy he seems. She has heard him talk like this before, she will say, and each time something terrible followed. It is the kind of thing a grieving widow says in hindsight, of course, the human mind's relentless need to find a pattern, an omen, some early warning sign buried in an ordinary Friday morning. But she says it before the evening is over, sitting beside him in a carriage with the spring air coming through the open windows, and he laughs gently at her and tells her she must not give in to such notions on a day as fine as this one. He has, by early afternoon, made a decision that will turn out to matter more than anyone in that carriage could have understood. He wants to go to the theater tonight. Ford's on 10th Street is putting on a popular comedy called Our American Cousin, and Mrs. Lincoln has already arranged for a box. General Grant and his wife Julia have been invited to join them, a small celebratory outing for two men who have, between them, carried the war on their respective shoulders for years. The Grants, as it happens, will not come. Julia Grant has no particular fondness for Mary Lincoln, whose temper and occasional public displays of jealousy have made other officers' wives wary of her company, and she persuades her husband that they should instead travel north that evening to see their children, who are waiting for them in New Jersey. It is, on its face, an utterly unremarkable decision, the kind of small domestic negotiation that happens in 1,000 marriages on 1,000 ordinary evenings. Grant agrees. They will leave by train later that afternoon. It is a decision that will, by nightfall, look very different in hindsight, because somewhere else in Washington this same morning, a different man has also been thinking very carefully about Ford's Theater and about exactly who is expected to be sitting in the presidential box that night. Part 2. The Actor's Morning. John Wilkes Booth's morning begins by his own written account just after midnight. He is 26 years old, and by any reasonable measure of his era, he is already a tremendous success, one of the most famous and most physically striking actors in the United States, a member of the country's most celebrated theatrical dynasty. A man whose face is recognized on the streets of cities he has never even performed in. His father was Junius Brutus Booth, a legendary tragedian whose name still carries weight on any American stage. His brother Edwin is, By most critical accounts, even more gifted than John and considerably more famous, Edwin will go on, within the year, to be celebrated as the greatest American actor of his generation, will perform Hamlet for 100 consecutive nights in New York to enormous acclaim. John Wilkes has built his own substantial reputation in his brother's shadow, touring relentlessly, drawing crowds with his athletic, almost violent stage presence. Audiences describe him leaping across stages, fighting duels with real conviction, throwing himself into death scenes with an intensity that other actors of the period found faintly alarming. He is also, and has been for years now, consumed by a hatred for the Union cause that has only deepened as that cause has won. He was born in Maryland, a slave state that never seceded, and his sympathies for the Confederacy run deep and old. He watched John Brown hang in 1859 and felt, by his own account, a kind of religious awe at the moment. Through the war years, while continuing to perform on northern stages, building wealth and fame in cities that would have arrested him on sight had they known the full extent of his sympathies, he has nursed an increasingly elaborate sense of personal grievance and historical destiny. He has invested in Confederate blockade-running schemes. He has smuggled medical supplies south. And for the better part of a year now, he has been the organizing center of a conspiracy that began, in its original form, as something almost theatrical in its ambition, a plan to kidnap the President of the United States and spirit him south to Richmond to be held as a bargaining chip for the release of Confederate prisoners of war. That plan failed in March, when Lincoln did not appear where Booth and his small band of conspirators had expected him to be. Richmond fell 2 weeks later, and by the time April arrives, with Lee's army broken and the Confederacy collapsing in real time across the South, Booth's plan has curdled into something far more final. His diary entry for these final days survives, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment because it offers something rare in this story: direct access to the interior of a man in the process of convincing himself to commit an assassination. "Our cause being almost lost," he writes, "something decisive and great must be done." It is the language of a man who has built an entire identity around grand historical gestures, who has spent his adult life performing the deaths of kings and conquerors on stage, and who has now decided, with a kind of theatrical fatalism, that the role he was always meant to play is waiting for him in real life. He had attended Lincoln's second inauguration a month earlier, in March, standing close enough to the platform that he would later write, with a chilling matter-of-factness, about what an excellent chance he had had if he wished to kill the president that very day. He did not act on it then. The kidnapping plot still held some appeal, perhaps because kidnapping, unlike murder, offered the fantasy of a clean escape, a hero's welcome in Richmond, a future beyond the act itself. By the morning of the 14th, that fantasy has collapsed along with the Confederacy it was meant to serve. There is no Richmond left to flee to, there is no army left to ransom prisoners from. What remains in Booth's increasingly narrow and increasingly desperate calculus is the act itself, not as a means to an end, but as the end in itself. A final, irreversible gesture against a war he has lost, and a man he has come to see as a tyrant, in language lifted wholesale from the classical assassination dramas he has spent his career performing. He writes a brief letter to his mother that morning. All is well, he tells her, but he is in haste. It is the kind of sentence a son writes when he cannot bring himself to write the truth, and does not want to lie outright either. Around noon, he walks to Ford's Theatre, a building he knows intimately, having performed there himself, and having maintained a friendly relationship with its management for years. His stated reason for the visit is mundane. He is collecting his mail, which the theatre holds for him as a courtesy extended to its more celebrated regular performers. While he is there, in the ordinary business of a theatre preparing for an evening performance, he overhears something that will determine the rest of his life, and the rest of American history, in the same breath. The President and General Grant, someone tells him, are expected to attend that evening's performance of Our American Cousin. The presidential box is being prepared. Booth does not react visibly by any surviving account. He simply absorbs the information the way an actor absorbs a cue, the moment in the script where everything that came before suddenly makes sense, where the scattered elements of a plan finally resolve into a single, clear action with a single, clear setting and a single, clear time. He has, by his own later writings and the testimony of those who knew him, spent months building a working knowledge of this particular theatre's architecture, its private boxes, its narrow access corridor, the door that leads from the dress circle to the presidential box. A door he knows can be barred from the inside if a man wished to buy himself a few uninterrupted seconds. He has performed on this stage. He has walked these corridors as a guest rather than an intruder. The theatre that will become the site of the most consequential murder in American history is, to John Wilkes Booth, simply a familiar room. He leaves Ford's that afternoon with a plan that has, within the space of a single conversation overheard in passing, gone from theoretical to absolute. The kidnapping conspiracy he has spent the better part of a year assembling, a loose, often quarrelsome network of Confederate sympathizers, none of whom fully share his theatrical sense of destiny, several of whom will spend the rest of their lives insisting they never agreed to anything beyond the original abduction scheme, is about to be redirected, within hours, towards something none of them originally signed up for. He spends the rest of the afternoon in motion, securing a horse from a livery stable on 6th Street, a fast bay mare he will need for a swift escape, making final preparations of equipment, and sometime in these hours gathering the small circle of men who have followed him this far to tell them that tonight, finally, after months of false starts and aborted attempts, the moment has arrived. What he proposes to them when they assemble is no longer a kidnapping. Part 3. The Carriage Ride. In the early afternoon, while John Wilkes Booth is securing a horse and gathering conspirators across the city, the president and his wife step into an open carriage for a drive through Washington. It is, on its surface, the smallest and least consequential scene in this entire story. Two middle-aged people taking advantage of fine spring weather, with nothing more dramatic on the agenda than fresh air and conversation. But it survives in the historical record in unusual detail, because Mary Lincoln will spend the rest of her life returning to it, turning it over, trying to extract some final meaning from an hour that felt at the time like nothing more than an ordinary afternoon. They drive without much fixed destination, the carriage rolling past the half-finished dome of the Capitol, itself a kind of monument to the unfinished business of the war. Construction having continued even through the darkest years of the conflict, a stubborn architectural insistence that the Union intended to survive long enough to need a working government building. They pass the Navy Yard, where Lincoln has expressed interest in visiting. The president is in an expansive mood. He talks, by Mary's later account, about the future with an openness he has rarely allowed himself across 4 years of crushing responsibility. He tells her he wants to travel once his term concludes, perhaps to the Pacific coast, perhaps further, to Europe or the Holy Land. The kind of grand leisurely tour that a man who has spent his entire adult life in small Illinois courtrooms and then in the suffocating pressure of wartime Washington has never permitted himself to imagine seriously before. He talks about returning, eventually, to the practice of law in Springfield, a quieter and more private life than the one fate handed him in 1860. He speaks, in short, like a man beginning to plan for an actual future, not the desperate month-to-month survival of a wartime presidency, but years, decades, an old age he can finally picture. Mary will later write that she had rarely, if ever, seen her husband so at ease. The chronic melancholy that friends and colleagues had noted in him for years, a sadness so persistent that even his law partners back in Illinois had remarked on it decades before the war, before any of the burdens of the presidency had been added to whatever weight he already carried inside himself, seems, for this one afternoon, to have lifted entirely. She tells him, at some point in the carriage, that his happiness almost frightens her. It is a strange thing to say on a fine April afternoon, and she will spend the rest of her life trying to explain exactly what she meant by it, why some instinct in her recoiled slightly from her husband's contentment rather than simply enjoying it alongside him. The most generous reading, the one that does not require us to believe in premonitions or omens, is simply this. Mary Lincoln had spent 4 years watching her husband under siege, his face aging visibly year over year under the strain of the war, and perhaps some part of her had become so accustomed to that strain that its sudden absence felt paradoxically like the absence of something essential rather than the presence of relief. Happiness, after enough years of its opposite, can feel unfamiliar enough to be unsettling. Lincoln, in any case, laughs off her concern. He tells her gently that they have both earned the right to be happy now. The war that swallowed 4 years of their lives, that took their young son Willie to typhoid in the middle of it, that aged him by what felt like a decade for every calendar year, is finally, genuinely, almost entirely over. Johnston's army is still in the field, but Grant expects its surrender within days. There is, for the first time since 1861, very little left to fear. They return to the White House in the late afternoon. There are still hours of ordinary business ahead of him, visitors to receive, papers to sign, the unglamorous daily machinery of the presidency that does not pause simply because a war has ended. But the carriage ride lingers in the accounts of everyone who later tried to reconstruct this day as a kind of final private gift. An hour in which the President of the United States was simply a man in his 50s, sitting beside his wife in the spring sunshine, allowing himself, for what would turn out to be the last time, to imagine growing old. He has, by early evening, confirmed the plans for that night. Ford's Theatre. A box has been reserved. The newspapers have already printed the announcement that the President and General Grant will attend, a piece of public information that will reach John Wilkes Booth's ears as readily as anyone else's, repeated and confirmed by the very theatre management, whose courtesy mailbox Booth visited only hours earlier. Grant, as it happens, will not be there. He and Julia have already decided, over the objections of no one in particular, to take an evening train north to see their children instead. It is a decision made for entirely ordinary, entirely domestic reasons, a wife's preference, a father's desire to see his family after a long campaign. And it will be remembered within 24 hours as one of the most consequential strokes of fortune in American history. Whatever else happens this night, General Ulysses S. Grant will not be in that box. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, are invited in the Grant's place. A young couple, the daughter and stepson of a New York senator, who accept with the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of two people invited to spend an evening at the theater in the company of the President. Evening approaches in the White House. Preparations for the outing continue with no sense of urgency, no awareness that anything is amiss. Across the city, in a rented room, and in a series of hurried meetings, a very different kind of preparation is underway. Part 4. Finalizing the plot. What John Wilkes Booth proposes to his fellow conspirators in the hours after his discovery at Ford's Theatre is no longer the elaborate kidnapping scheme that has occupied them on and off for the better part of a year. It is something far simpler, far more final, and far more frightening to at least one of the men in the room. The plan, as Booth lays it out, is this. At the same hour tonight, 3 separate attacks will take place across the city, aimed at decapitating the federal government in a single coordinated stroke. Booth himself will go to Ford's Theatre and kill the president. A man named Lewis Powell, tall, powerfully built, a former Confederate soldier whose capacity for violence Booth has come to rely on, will go to the home of Secretary of State William Seward and kill him as he lies recovering from a recent and nearly fatal carriage accident. A third conspirator, George Atzerodt, a German immigrant who has spent the war years quietly ferrying Confederate agents across the Potomac in his small boat, will go to the Kirkwood House Hotel and kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. The logic, such as it is, has a certain brutal coherence to it. Kill the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State in the same hour, and the federal government is left without any clear, immediate line of succession functioning at all. A decapitation strike against the institutions of the Union at the precise moment of its supposed triumph. It is the kind of plan that makes a certain abstract sense on paper, drawn up by a man who has spent his career thinking in terms of dramatic structure and decisive final acts, and very little sense as an actual operational plan, dependent as it is on 3 men with wildly different temperaments and wildly different levels of commitment to violence, all acting independently, all succeeding, all on the same night, within the same narrow window of time. Lewis Powell, for his part, accepts his assignment with the same flat, unhesitating competence that has characterized his entire wartime career. He is 20 years old, a former Confederate cavalryman who fought at Gettysburg, was wounded and captured, escaped, and eventually drifted into the orbit of Confederate intelligence operations in Washington. He has killed men before, in uniform, and the prospect of killing one more, even an unarmed, bedridden one, does not appear to trouble him in any way the surviving record reflects. He is given David Herold, a younger and considerably less formidable conspirator, to serve as his guide through the unfamiliar streets and his accomplice in the escape afterward. George Atzerodt is a different matter entirely. He has spent the war as a smuggler and a boatman, useful precisely because he is unremarkable, the kind of man who can move quietly across the Potomac without drawing attention, who has never by any account shown the slightest personal inclination toward violence against another human being. When Booth tells him this afternoon that his role in the conspiracy has shifted from logistics to assassination, that he is now expected to walk into a hotel, find the Vice President of the United States, and kill him at close range, something in Atzerodt simply refuses to cooperate. He does not openly object, by most accounts. He does not argue with Booth, whose volatile temper and absolute conviction in his own historical destiny have made him a difficult man to contradict in these final fevered weeks. But something has clearly broken in his resolve, and as the evening approaches, his commitment to the plan will continue to dissolve, conversation by conversation, drink by drink, until the moment of action arrives and he simply does not go. Booth, characteristically, does not allow himself to dwell on these uncertainties. By his own account, and by the testimony of those who saw him in these final hours, he is almost euphoric, moving through the city with a kind of manic, theatrical energy, stopping to speak with acquaintances, dropping cryptic remarks that several people will later recall with a chill given what followed. He visits the National Hotel where he has been staying and retrieves the weapons he intends to use, a small single-shot Derringer pistol, barely larger than a man's palm, and a heavy Bowie knife. The pistol is, by any practical military standard, an almost absurdly inadequate weapon, capable of firing a single shot before it must be entirely reloaded, a process that takes the better part of a minute and is therefore useless in any kind of sustained confrontation. But Booth does not intend a sustained confrontation. He intends one shot, fired at point-blank range into the back of an unsuspecting man's skull, in a theater box he has scouted in advance, with an escape route he has already planned down to the horse waiting outside. He spends part of the afternoon at the livery stable, confirming the horse he has rented, a fast, well-trained bay mare, chosen specifically for its speed and its calm temperament around gunfire, a detail that suggests just how methodically Booth has been preparing for this moment, even while the broader conspiracy around him remained focused on kidnapping rather than murder. He rides the mare briefly to confirm her responsiveness. He returns to Ford's Theatre sometime in the mid-afternoon, ostensibly on ordinary business, and uses the opportunity to bore a small hole in the door of the presidential box, a peephole, just large enough to observe the box's interior before committing to the act, a piece of premeditation so precise and so cold-blooded that it is difficult even now to read about without a certain involuntary chill. He also, during this visit, takes a wooden music stand or a similar piece of furniture from backstage and wedges it against the outer door of the box's access corridor, a simple but effective bar that will, when the moment comes, buy him several crucial seconds against anyone attempting to pursue him from outside. By the time the sun begins to set over Washington, the architecture of the plot is essentially complete. 3 men have been assigned 3 targets, weapons have been gathered, an escape route has been planned, running south out of the city, across the Navy Yard Bridge, into the relative safety of rural Maryland, where Confederate sympathies still run deep and where Booth has, over the preceding months, quietly cultivated a network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts who will, in the desperate days ahead, hide him, feed him, and ultimately fail to save him from the largest manhunt in American history to that point. Atzerodt drinks, Powell waits with grim professional patience, and John Wilkes Booth, the most famous face in the conspiracy, the man whose recognizable features will doom any hope of a clean escape the moment the deed is done, makes his way toward a saloon next door to Ford's Theatre to have a final drink before showtime, a piece of theatre, in the most literal sense, that he has been rehearsing in his mind for weeks, and is now, finally, only hours away from performing. Part 5. To the theatre. The President is, by his own staff's account, somewhat reluctant to go out at all that evening. It has been a long and full day, the cabinet meeting, the carriage ride, the ordinary accumulated business of the presidency that does not pause for good moods or fine weather. He has told at least one aide that he would honestly prefer a quiet evening at home. But the newspapers have already announced that he and General Grant will be attending Ford's Theatre tonight, and Mary has her heart set on the outing, and there is something in Lincoln's character, a deep, almost compulsive sense of obligation to the public, to the appearance of normalcy, to the idea that the President of the United States ought to be visible and accessible to the people he serves, even after 4 years of war that would have justified any number of withdrawals into private security, that makes him reluctant to disappoint either his wife or the public expectation that has already been set. There is also underlying the decision something simpler. General Grant's withdrawal from the evening has left a gap, and Lincoln, ever conscious of the symbolic weight of his public appearances, does not want the cancellation of a presidential outing to read as anything alarming on a night that is, by every available indication, meant to be a celebration. The war is over, or as good as over. The capital is in a mood of relief bordering on euphoria. It would seem strange, even discourteous, for the president to stay home. So preparations proceed. Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris, the young couple invited in the Grant's place, arrive at the White House in the early evening, and the four of them, the president, his wife, and their two younger guests, set off by carriage toward 10th Street, where Ford's Theater stands lit and waiting. The president's bodyguard for the evening is a Washington police officer named John Frederick Parker, a man whose record, even before this night, includes multiple disciplinary complaints, instances of public drunkenness, and at least one prior occasion of falling asleep on duty. He is, by any reasonable assessment, an unfortunate choice for an assignment of this importance, though the broader truth is that presidential security in 1865 is, by modern standards, almost non-existent, a single officer with no formal protocol for securing a theater box, no coordination with the theater's own staff, no real institutional understanding yet of what it might mean to protect a head of state from deliberate, premeditated violence in a public setting. The very concept of a presidential assassination is, to most Americans in this moment, something that simply does not happen in the United States, a European phenomenon, the stuff of unstable monarchies and ancient grudges, not something that belongs in a republic less than a century removed from its founding. The carriage arrives at Ford's Theater a little after the performance has already begun. The orchestra, recognizing the president's arrival, stops the regular music and strikes up "Hail to the Chief" as the small party makes its way up to the box, a flag-draped enclosure created, for the occasion, by removing the partition between two adjoining boxes to give the president and his guests a wider, more comfortable view of the stage. The audience rises. There is applause, sustained and genuinely warm, the kind of reception a war-weary public gives to the man who has carried them through the worst of it. The president, by several accounts, bows slightly and takes his seat, visibly pleased by the welcome. Our American cousin resumes. It is, by the standards of serious drama, a slight and unambitious piece of theater, a broad comedy about a brash, unrefined American visiting his aristocratic English relatives, full of fish-out-of-water jokes and exaggerated regional accents, the kind of crowd-pleasing entertainment that asks very little of its audience beyond a willingness to laugh. It is precisely the kind of evening Lincoln, by every account from those who knew him, genuinely enjoyed. He had little patience for ponderous tragedy and a well-documented fondness for comedy, for Shakespeare's lighter plays, for the simple pleasure of being made to laugh after years of carrying almost unimaginable weight. He settles into his rocking chair, brought specially to the box for his comfort, and takes Mary's hand. Major Rathbone and Clara Harris sit nearby. Officer Parker, having escorted the party to the box, does not take up a fixed position guarding its door. Instead, sometime in the course of the performance, the exact moment is lost to history, though most accounts place it sometime after the play has resumed. He leaves his post entirely, drawn by the same ordinary human impulse that has derailed security arrangements throughout history. He is bored, the play does not interest him from where he is positioned, and there is a tavern next door where he can get a clearer view of the stage from a side window or simply enjoy a drink while the performance continues without him. He will later claim, in the limited testimony that survives, that he believed his duty was simply to escort the president to his seat, not to remain stationed outside the box for the duration of the performance, a gap in protocol so basic, so almost unbelievable in retrospect, that it has fueled a century and a half of speculation about negligence, conspiracy, and institutional failure. The truth, as is so often the case with catastrophic historical failures, appears to be simpler and more mundane than any conspiracy theory. A single man, given an assignment he did not fully understand the gravity of, made an ordinary, human, catastrophic mistake and walked away from the one door that mattered most in the entire building. The play continues. The audience laughs, gasps, applauds at the appropriate moments. In the box above, the President of the United States watches a forgettable English comedy with his wife's hand in the kind of relaxed, unguarded posture that 4 years of total war have rarely permitted him. Outside, in the alley behind the theatre, a man ties a fast bay mare to a post and checks, one final time, the weight of a small pistol in his coat pocket. Part 6. The Star Saloon. Booth's evening, up to this point, has had the strange rhythm of a man performing his ordinary public role while privately rehearsing something extraordinary. He has spent part of the early evening visiting friends and acquaintances, dropping in and out of conversations with the easy, practiced charm that has made him one of the most socially welcome young actors in Washington, regardless of which side of the war's political divide a given host happened to favor. Several people who encounter him in these hours will later recall odd, unsettling fragments of conversation, remarks about the South being avenged, comments that seemed cryptic or melodramatic at the time and chilling in retrospect, the kind of thing a man says when some part of him wants, almost unconsciously, to leave a trail of warning that nobody quite picks up on until it is too late to matter. He arrives at Ford's Theatre sometime after the performance has begun, not through the front entrance where a ticket taker might note his arrival with any particular suspicion. He is, after all, a familiar face in this building, a celebrated actor with every reasonable pretext for moving freely through its corridors, but through the rear stage door, the same entrance the theatre's own performers and stagehands use routinely throughout an evening's performance, he leaves his rented mare in the alley behind the building. In the care of a stagehand he has paid for the favor, the horse positioned and ready for the fastest possible departure once the act is complete. For a period of perhaps an hour, by most reconstructions of the evening, Booth does not go directly to the presidential box. Instead, he steps next door to the Star Saloon, a tavern immediately adjacent to the theatre that does brisk business serving patrons during intermissions and, on a night like this one, serving a fair number of people simply passing the time before or during a performance. They have no particular urgency to watch in full. He orders whiskey. The bartender will later testify to the encounter in detail, in the exhaustive series of hearings and depositions that follow the assassination. Booth, by this account, drinks with a kind of deliberate, controlled steadiness, neither rushing the glass nor lingering excessively over it, the behavior of a man either entirely calm or working very hard to appear that way. He makes brief conversation. Nothing in his manner, according to the bartender, suggests a man on the verge of committing the most consequential act of violence in the nation's young history. It is worth pausing here on the strange psychological texture of this hour, an actor sitting in a public bar, sharing a wall with the theater where the President of the United States is at this moment laughing at a comedy, knowing exactly what he intends to do within the next 60 minutes, and apparently capable of holding an ordinary conversation about nothing in particular while that knowledge sits inside him like a coiled spring. Whatever else can be said about John Wilkes Booth, and a great deal will be said by historians and psychologists and amateur theorists for the century and a half that follows, he possessed in this final hour an almost frightening capacity for composure. He checks the time more than once, by several accounts, glancing toward the saloon's clock with the particular restlessness of a man waiting for a specific cue rather than simply killing time. He has, by this point in the evening, scouted the play itself closely enough to know its structure. He has likely seen Our American Cousin performed before, or has at minimum studied its script closely enough to identify the precise moment, late in the third act, when a single character delivers a line reliably guaranteed to provoke the loudest laugh of the entire evening. It is a small, mean piece of theatrical knowledge, and Booth intends to use it with the precision of a man who has spent his entire professional life studying exactly how an audience responds to a well-timed line. He does not merely intend to commit murder in a crowded theater. He intends to commit it at the one moment in the performance when the sound of a gunshot stands the best possible chance of being absorbed, for a few crucial seconds, into the sound of an audience laughing. Sometime close to the appointed hour, he finishes his drink, settles his account, and steps back out into the cool April night. He crosses the short distance back to the theater's front entrance this time, a deliberate choice, since the front door will put him on the same level as the dress circle and the presidential box above it, rather than backstage, among the performers and crew who might recognize him too readily for comfort in his current state of barely contained tension. He enters through the lobby. A military surgeon seated nearby, a man named George Brainerd Todd, will later recall watching Booth walk slowly along the side of the theater where the presidential box sits, recall hearing another patron murmur, almost casually, "There's Booth," the small, unremarkable observation of a recognizable celebrity spotted in a public place. Nothing more alarming than that, the words of a man pointing out a famous face in a crowd with no possible way of knowing what those words would come to mean within the hour. Booth continues his slow walk toward the box door. He pauses near it. He takes a calling card from his coat pocket, the kind of formal courtesy a gentleman of his social standing might present to request entry anywhere, an utterly ordinary gesture that disguises, completely, the extraordinary thing it is about to enable. He writes something briefly on the card and hands it to an usher who carries it toward the door of the presidential box. Inside, unaware, the President of the United States is laughing at a joke about manners and inheritance, his wife's hand resting in his. Part 7, 10:15. The usher accepts the card without particular alarm. There is, by this point in the evening, no guard at the outer door to question or detain anyone. Officer Parker's absence has left a vacancy that nobody else in the building has thought to fill, and the ordinary protocols of a theater accustomed to admitting patrons by ticket and courtesy rather than by security clearance simply absorb Booth's presence the way they would absorb any other recognized face. He is shown through. He steps into the narrow, darkened passage that leads to the door of the presidential box, a passage he has walked before, as a performer rather than an intruder, and one he knows from his earlier visit that afternoon, well enough to navigate without hesitation even in the dim light. He pulls the wooden bar he planted earlier across the outer door behind him, wedging it firmly enough to delay anyone attempting to follow him from the dress circle. It is a small, almost absurdly simple piece of tradecraft, and it will prove devastatingly effective in the chaos of the next several minutes, as people in the audience realize something has gone catastrophically wrong. The barred door will cost precious seconds that might otherwise have been spent in pursuit. He approaches the inner door of the box itself. Through the small hole he bored that afternoon, he can see, in the dim spill of stage light reflecting up into the box, the silhouette of the man he has come to kill, seated in a low rocking chair, leaning slightly forward, entirely absorbed in the performance below. On stage, the comedy has reached its climax, or rather, the climax of its current scene, a piece of broad physical and verbal humor involving a character named Asa Trenchard, an unrefined American confronting the rigid social pretensions of his English relatives. The line that follows is one of the play's most reliable laugh lines, delivered by the character Lord Dundreary's foil, with a kind of clueless, insulting bluntness about social propriety that on a night like this one, with an audience already primed for entertainment after years of wartime austerity, lands with particular force. Laughter rolls through the house, loud, sustained, the unguarded collective laughter of an audience that has, for 90 minutes, been allowed to simply enjoy itself. It is, by every careful reconstruction of this moment, the precise window Booth has been waiting for. He opens the inner door of the box. He steps inside. The small space is dim, lit only by the ambient glow from the stage below, crowded with 4 people who have no reason whatsoever to expect an intrusion. The president in his rocking chair nearest the door, his wife beside him, Major Rathbone and Clara Harris, seated slightly behind. Nobody turns, nobody reacts. The laughter from below continues to fill the theater, and beneath its cover a single man crosses the last few feet of distance between himself and the back of the president's head, raises a small single-shot pistol, and fires. The sound, when it comes, is smaller than one might expect from an act of this magnitude, a sharp crack, not unlike the report of a firework or a stage prop, the kind of sound that for a fraction of a second, several people in the surrounding boxes and the orchestra below will later say they assumed was simply part of the performance, a sound effect, nothing alarming at all. It is precisely the confusion Booth has counted on. The bullet, fired at a range of perhaps 2 feet, strikes the president in the back of the skull, just behind his left ear, and lodges deep within his brain. He does not cry out. He does not move suddenly or violently. He simply slumps forward, almost gently, his head tilting toward his chest, in a posture that Mary Lincoln, sitting beside him with her hand still resting in his, will not immediately recognize as catastrophic. For a moment, in the dim light and the lingering sound of the audience's laughter, it might almost look as though her husband has simply dozed off. The room fills with gun smoke. Major Rathbone, reacting with the speed of a trained military officer, even in his confusion, lunges toward the figure who has just fired the shot. Booth, still holding the pistol in one hand, draws a heavy knife with the other and slashes at Rathbone, opening a deep wound along the Major's arm. A wound severe enough that Rathbone will lose a significant quantity of blood before the night is over, though he will, unlike the President, survive it. Booth shoves past him. He reaches the railing of the box, swings himself over it, and drops to the stage below, a fall of perhaps 10 or 11 feet, not enormous, but awkward, complicated by a spur on his boot that catches, by several accounts, on the bunting and the flag draped across the front of the box. He lands badly. There is a sharp, audible crack as a bone in his lower left leg fractures, though Booth, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate momentum of the moment, will not fully register the severity of the injury until hours later, when the adrenaline has faded and the long, agonizing reality of a shattered leg, ridden hard across miles of dark countryside, finally catches up with him. He rises from the stage floor, faces the stunned audience for a moment, and shouts a phrase he has clearly prepared in advance, the kind of theatrical flourish that a lifetime in front of audiences has trained into him as instinctively as breathing. Sic semper tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants. The motto of the state of Virginia, the words attributed in popular legend to Brutus at the moment of Caesar's assassination, a piece of classical reference that Booth, the son of an actor named for that same Brutus, has clearly been rehearsing in his mind for longer than anyone in the audience could have imagined. Some accounts have him adding further words, "The South is avenged," or some close variation, though the exact phrasing shouted in the chaos and confusion of the moment is remembered differently by different witnesses, the way traumatic memories so often fracture into competing, equally sincere versions of the same instant. For a handful of seconds, the audience does not fully comprehend what it has just witnessed. This is, after all, an actor they recognize on a stage where actors belong, delivering a line in a theatrical voice during what might, for one suspended moment, still be mistaken for some bizarre addition to the evening's entertainment. And then Mary Lincoln screams. It is her scream more than anything else that breaks the spell. She has turned to her husband, has perhaps reached for him, has perhaps already felt the terrible stillness, where there should have been the ordinary motion of a living man, and the sound she makes cuts through the confusion of the theater with a clarity that no amount of stage business can be mistaken for. The audience surges to its feet. Someone shouts that the president has been shot. The word spreads through the crowded house in a matter of seconds, a wave of comprehension moving outward from the box, transforming a theater full of laughing, relaxed patrons into a theater full of people screaming, climbing over seats, pressing toward the stage in a chaotic, useless surge that accomplishes nothing except to make the confusion worse. Booth, his leg broken, but his escape route planned with the same precision as everything else this evening, limps rapidly across the stage and out through the wings, shoving aside a stagehand who makes a half-hearted attempt to grab him. He reaches the alley where his mare waits, mounts despite the searing pain in his leg, and rides off into the Washington night, south, toward the Navy Yard Bridge, toward Maryland, toward a network of safe houses and sympathizers he has spent months quietly cultivating against exactly this kind of desperate need. Inside the box, a young military surgeon named Charles Lyell, who happens to be in the audience that night and who reaches the box within moments of the chaos beginning, pushes through the crush of people and finds the President of the United States slumped in his chair, unconscious, a small but unmistakable wound at the back of his skull. Lyell examines him as quickly as the cramped, dim space allows and delivers within minutes the assessment that will define the rest of this night. The wound is mortal. There is no possibility of recovery. The only question remaining is how long the President's body will continue to function before it finally, inevitably, fails. He cannot be moved far. The jolting motion of a carriage ride back to the White House, Lyell determines almost immediately, would likely kill him before they arrived. What is needed is somewhere close, anywhere with a bed, anywhere the dying man can be laid flat and made as comfortable as circumstances allow, while the small, hopeless vigil that is about to consume the rest of the night gets underway. Across the street from the theater, in a modest boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson, a light still burns in a back bedroom. Part 8. At the same hour. While the chaos at Ford's Theatre is still spreading outward in its first confused seconds, across the city at a townhouse on Lafayette Square within sight of the White House itself. A second act of violence is unfolding in almost perfect synchrony. Secretary of State William Seward is, on this particular night, already a man in considerable physical distress, entirely unrelated to the war he has helped steer the nation through. 9 days earlier, he suffered a serious carriage accident. His horses bolted, he was thrown from the vehicle, and he sustained a broken jaw and a broken arm severe enough that he has spent the days since confined to bed. His jaw wired and braced in a heavy metal contraption designed to hold the fractured bone in place while it heals, his body wrapped and immobilized in ways that leave him almost entirely helpless. He is, in the cruelest possible sense, the easiest of the 3 targets Booth has selected for this night, a man who cannot run, cannot easily defend himself, who is propped up in his own bed, attended by family and a hired nurse, utterly unprepared for what is about to walk through his front door. That night, a tall, powerfully built young man arrives at the Seward residence carrying a small package and explaining with calm and entirely plausible courtesy that he has been sent by the secretary's physician with medicine that must be delivered directly into the patient's hands with instructions on its use. This is Lewis Powell and the cover story he has constructed, a medical errand, the kind of small mercy a recovering invalid's household would have no particular reason to question, gets him past the front door and partway up the stairs before anyone in the household begins to sense that something is wrong. Frederick Seward, the secretary's son, intercepts Powell on the landing outside his father's bedroom, explaining that the secretary is sleeping and cannot be disturbed. Powell, his cover story exhausted and his patients apparently equally so, does not argue further. He produces a pistol, attempts to fire it at Frederick at close range. The weapon, by several accounts, either misfires or simply fails to discharge properly, and instead brings it down as a bludgeon, striking Frederick Seward across the skull with such brutal force that the young man collapses, his head split open, the damage severe enough that he will remain unconscious for days and will not fully recover his health for months afterward. Powell pushes past the unconscious son and bursts into the secretary's bedroom. What follows is one of the most savage individual episodes of this entire night, far more drawn out, far more physically brutal than the single clean shot that has just been fired across town. Powell draws a heavy knife and falls upon the bedridden secretary, slashing at his face and throat with what witnesses will later describe as a kind of frenzied, almost animal violence. Seward, trapped in his bed by his own injuries, unable to rise or flee, can do little more than try to twist his body away from the blade. He is slashed repeatedly across the face and neck, deep wounds that bleed with terrifying profusion, and it is, in a strange and almost unbearable irony, the very metal brace fitted to his broken jaw. The apparatus installed to treat one injury entirely unrelated to tonight's violence that very likely saves his life, deflecting the angle of Powell's knife just enough, in at least one crucial stroke, to prevent the blade from finding his throat's most vital vessels directly. Seward's daughter Fanny, who has been keeping watch over her father, begins screaming. A male nurse attending the secretary, a soldier named George Robinson recovering from his own wounds, throws himself bodily at Powell and is slashed across the head and shoulders for his trouble. But his intervention buys crucial seconds, seconds in which another Seward son, Augustus, awakened by the commotion, arrives and joins the desperate struggle to drag Powell off his father. Powell, finding himself now fighting against 3 injured but determined men in a confined bedroom, rather than the single helpless invalid he expected, finally breaks free and flees down the stairs and out into the street, slashing at a State Department messenger who has the misfortune to be arriving at the house at that exact moment, wounding him as well before disappearing into the dark. He leaves behind a scene of almost unbelievable carnage for a single uninterrupted assault. The Secretary of State bleeding heavily from multiple wounds to his face and neck, his son Frederick unconscious with a fractured skull, his son Augustus and the nurse Robinson both wounded in the struggle, his daughter Fanny screaming in shock, blood, by multiple later accounts, soaking into the bedclothes and pooling on the floor in quantities that horrified even the doctors who arrived soon after, men who had spent 4 years treating battlefield wounds and considered themselves by 1865 difficult to shock. And yet, against every reasonable expectation given the sheer ferocity of the attack, William Seward will survive. The wounds, though severe and disfiguring, he will carry the scars for the rest of his life. miss by margins of mere fractions of an inch in several places the arteries and vital structures that would have killed him outright. He will go on to serve for years afterward in the same office, will negotiate the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, in a transaction that critics will mock at the time as Seward's folly, and that history will eventually vindicate many times over. He survives a night that, by any reasonable accounting of the violence inflicted on him, he had very little business surviving. Powell, his medical alibi abandoned, his coordinated timing with Booth's attack across town, achieved almost to the minute, despite the two men having no way to directly synchronize their watches or confirm each other's progress, flees into the Washington night on foot, having lost track in the chaos of his own waiting horse and his guide David Herold, who fled the scene the moment the screaming started, leaving Powell to find his own way through a city that will, within hours, be the site of the largest manhunt the nation has ever conducted. Meanwhile, across the city, the third planned attack of the evening simply does not happen. George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel, has spent the preceding hours drinking instead, his nerve, never strong to begin with, dissolving completely as the appointed hour approached. He goes to the hotel, by some accounts, gets as far as the bar downstairs, and then simply leaves, wandering the streets of Washington in a state of mounting panic, abandoning not only his assignment, but very nearly his own knife, which he leaves behind in his hotel room, a piece of evidence that will, within days, help investigators identify him as a participant in the broader conspiracy. Andrew Johnson, the Vice President of the United States, sleeps undisturbed through the entire night, entirely unaware that he was meant to die in his hotel room at almost exactly the hour his predecessor was being shot across town. Unaware, until morning brings the news that will make him, within hours, the 17th President of the United States. By the time these three separate, simultaneous acts of violence have run their course, one savagely brutal and ultimately survived, one a single fatal shot, and one abandoned entirely in a haze of failed nerve, word is already beginning to spread through Washington's streets, carried by panicked messengers and shouted from house to house, that something has happened to the president. The city that went to sleep, or attempted to, in a mood of victorious relief, is about to wake, within the hour, into something closer to a nightmare. Part 9. Across the street. They carry him out of the theater on a makeshift stretcher, soldiers from the audience pressed into service for lack of any better option, moving with the careful, desperate slowness of men who understand that every jolt of the journey might be the one that finally finishes what the bullet has already begun. Dr. Leal has determined that the White House, several blocks distant across a city already filling with panicked crowds and clattering carriages, is simply too far. What is needed is the nearest available bed, regardless of whose house it happens to be in, and as the small procession emerges from the theater's front entrance into a street already thick with horrified onlookers, someone notices a light still burning across the road in the front parlor window of a modest brick boarding house. The house belongs to William Peterson, a German-born tailor, and on this particular night it is occupied by its usual assortment of boarders, clerks, a soldier, ordinary working Washingtonians, who have no possible reason to expect that their landlord's home is about to become, within the hour, the most closely watched bedroom in the United States. A boarder near the door, hearing the commotion outside, opens it before anyone has to ask, and the small, grim procession carries the President of the United States across the threshold and down a narrow hallway to a back bedroom, a plain, unremarkable room containing little more than a single bed, a washstand, and a few prints on the wallpapered walls, the kind of room rented out by the week to single working men, never imagined by anyone as the place where a presidency would end. The bed itself presents an immediate, almost grotesquely practical problem. Lincoln, even by the standards of his own era, is an extraordinarily tall man, 6 feet 4 inches, with long, characteristically awkward limbs that have been the subject of countless newspaper cartoons throughout his political career, and the bed in this modest rented room is built to ordinary dimensions, far too short to accommodate him lying flat in any conventional position. The soldiers and doctors attending him solve the problem with the same improvised practicality that has characterized this entire desperate night. They lay him diagonally across the mattress, his head toward one corner, and his long frame angled across the bed's width rather than its length, a position that allows his body to fit, but that strikes everyone who later describes the scene as something deeply, almost unbearably undignified. The President of the United States, the man who has just preserved the Union through 4 years of catastrophic war, dying at an awkward diagonal angle in a stranger's rented bed because no one thought to build the furniture large enough to hold him properly. Word spreads through Washington with the particular terrible speed that catastrophic news always seems to find, regardless of the limited communication technology of the era. Within the hour, the modest house on 10th Street is surrounded by a dense, anxious crowd, and inside, the front parlor has been transformed into something resembling a wartime command post. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrives within the first hour, and upon assessing the situation, the dying president in the back bedroom, the news of the simultaneous attack on Seward already reaching him, the very real possibility that this represents the opening stage of some broader, still unfolding conspiracy against the entire government, effectively takes charge of the United States government from a borrowed front parlor, a small, intense, indispensable man conducting the affairs of a nation in crisis from a rented room he had never set foot in before this night, and would likely never have entered again under any other circumstances. Stanton, by virtually every account of these hours, becomes in the most literal sense the government. He dispatches telegrams across the country, summoning General Grant back to Washington immediately, alerting military commanders, ordering the city's bridges watched and its roads patrolled in an attempt to catch whoever has done this before they can escape entirely. He begins, within these same desperate hours, the process of gathering eyewitness testimony, interviewing anyone who saw anything at the theater, anyone who might identify the assassin, building in real time, in the middle of a personal and national catastrophe, the foundation of what will become the largest criminal investigation in American history to that date. A clerk takes dictation at his elbow throughout the night, recording his orders and statements as fast as he can produce them. The historical record of these hours preserved almost entirely because one meticulous, grief-stricken man insisted on documenting everything, even as his closest political ally lay dying in the next room. The bedroom itself becomes, over the course of the night, almost unbearably crowded. Doctors rotating in and out, taking turns at the bedside, periodically checking the president's pulse and breathing, applying what limited treatments 19th century medicine can offer to a wound that everyone present understands, with growing certainty as the hours pass, to be entirely beyond any treatment's power to address. There is, in truth, very little the doctors can actually do beyond simply observing, monitoring the slow, inexorable failure of a brain, too badly damaged to sustain the body around it, for very much longer. Several of them will later describe the strange helplessness of those hours, trained physicians accustomed to fighting for their patients' lives, reduced to the role of witnesses, keeping watch over a death they cannot prevent, or even meaningfully delay. Mary Lincoln spends most of the night in the adjoining front room, prostrate with grief, periodically brought in to sit beside her husband's bed, for brief intervals before being led back out again, her presence in the sick room itself becoming, as the night wears on, almost too much for those attending the president to manage alongside their other responsibilities, her grief so total and so overwhelming that at one point, according to several accounts, her uncontrolled weeping at the bedside prompts Stanton himself, gentle but firm, to ask that she be kept in the other room for the remainder of the vigil. Her eldest son, Robert, who only that morning had been describing Lee's surrender to his father over breakfast, now sits largely in stunned, silent grief beside his mother, the events of the day having compressed an entire emotional lifetime into a single set of impossible hours. Cabinet members arrive throughout the night, one by one, summoned from their own homes by the same urgent messengers fanning out across the city. Men who had sat with the president in that same room only that morning, listening to him describe a dream about a strange vessel moving toward a dark and indefinite shore, now gathered instead around his deathbed, watching the slow, irreversible conclusion of whatever that dream had been trying, in its oblique and unknowable way, to tell him. The wound itself allows for no real uncertainty about the outcome, even as the body continues its slow, mechanical persistence through the night. The bullet has traveled deep into the brain, and what remains, through the long hours between the shooting and the dawn, is simply the body's stubborn, involuntary insistence on continuing to breathe for as long as its most basic functions can be sustained, a process that the attending physicians can observe and record, but cannot meaningfully alter, no matter how skilled or how desperately devoted they are to the task in front of them. Outside, the crowd in the street continues to grow, word having spread to every corner of the city by now, ordinary Washingtonians standing in the cold April night outside a stranger's boarding house, waiting for news that everyone gathered there has already in their hearts begun to understand is not going to be good news, no matter how long the waiting continues inside. In the small back bedroom, the breathing grows steadily more labored as the night wears on toward morning, the particular terrible rhythm that experienced physicians recognize as the body's final mechanisms beginning, one by one, to fail. The long night. The hours between midnight and dawn pass in a slow, grinding accumulation of small, terrible details that those present will carry with them for the rest of their lives. The irregular catch and release of labored breathing, the doctor's increasingly grave whispered consultations in the hallway, the candle wax burning low, the crowd outside thickening, and then, toward the small hours, falling into an exhausted, anxious quiet of its own. Mary Lincoln is brought in twice more before morning, each visit ending the same way, in collapse and removal from the room. Cabinet members take turns standing watch in pairs, unable to do anything more useful than simply bear witness, the way grief so often demands witnesses even when it has no further use for action. Somewhere in these hours, Robert Lincoln, 21 years old, watches his father's chest rise and fall with diminishing strength and understands, with the particular clarity that arrives only in the worst nights of a person's life, that there is nothing left to hope for, only time left to endure. Part 10, 7:22, in the morning. He stops breathing in the very last hour before dawn. The doctors who have kept their long vigil note the moment with the precise, almost ceremonial attention that medicine reserves for the deaths it has been powerless to prevent. The president's pulse, already faint and irregular for some time, finally fails entirely. Surgeon General Joseph Barnes, who has attended through much of the night, places his hand against the chest one final time, waits the appropriate interval to be certain, and pronounces Abraham Lincoln dead at 22 minutes past 7 in the morning, on the 15th of April, 1865. The room falls into a silence that several of those present will later describe as somehow louder than anything that came before it. Edwin Stanton, the indispensable, indefatigable man who has spent the entire night functioning as the operational government of the United States from a borrowed parlor, is reported by multiple witnesses to have spoken the words that history has remembered ever since, whether or not he said them in precisely this form. Now he belongs to the ages. Mary Lincoln, brought in for the final moment, breaks down entirely. She will be led from the house and back to the White House in a state that those around her describe as something close to shattered, a grief so total that she will, in the days and weeks that follow, prove unable even to attend her husband's own funeral, confined instead to her bed in the White House, while the nation outside mourns a man she cannot bring herself to leave her room to publicly grieve. There is, in the hours immediately following, a piece of forensic detail that surfaces later and lands, even now, with a strange and specific weight. During the autopsy conducted that same day as Army surgeons carefully examined the wound and the damage it caused, the bullet itself, the small misshapen piece of lead that ended the life of the President of the United States, works loose during the procedure and falls with a small, almost unbearably ordinary clatter into a metal basin. Edward Curtis, the Army surgeon present, will later write that the assembled doctors found themselves simply staring at it for a long moment. This small object, this commonplace mass-manufactured piece of metal, responsible in his words for such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never fully realize. Mary, even amid her devastation, sends a brief note to the surgeons performing the autopsy with a single, small, deeply human request, that they clip a lock of her husband's hair for her to keep. It is granted. It is in its way the first of countless small relics that will, in the years and decades to come, attach themselves to this single April night, locks of hair, fragments of blood-stained fabric, the chair he sat in, the door he was carried through, the bed too short to hold him, an entire culture's accumulated, almost desperate need to hold on to physical fragments of a man whose death arrived with such sudden, irreversible finality that the ordinary process of grief seems, for years afterward, to require something tangible to attach itself to. The president's body is placed in a temporary coffin and carried, under armed cavalry escort, back to the White House, where a full autopsy and the preparations for the public lying in state that will follow begin within hours, the first, smallest steps in what will become one of the largest public mourning events in the nation's history. A funeral procession that will eventually carry his body by train across more than 1,000 miles, through city after city, watched by tens of thousands of grieving citizens lining the tracks, before finally reaching its resting place in Springfield, Illinois, the small prairie town from which an obscure country lawyer departed for Washington only 4 years earlier, with no particular certainty that he would ever return alive. But that long, mournful homeward journey is still days away. For now, in the grey, early light of an April morning, the news is only beginning to spread, carried by telegraph wires humming across the entire reunited nation, into newspaper offices working through the night to set the most consequential headline most of them will ever print, into the homes of a public that went to sleep believing the worst of the war was finally, mercifully behind them, and who will wake instead to learn that the man who carried them through it has not survived to see the peace he spent 4 years fighting for. Out in the Maryland countryside, many miles from the quiet, grief-stricken room on 10th Street, a man with a freshly splintered, agonizing broken leg is, at this same hour, only just beginning to understand exactly how large and how relentless the search for him is about to become. Part 11, the 12-day hunt. By the time the sun rises over Washington on the morning of the 15th, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth has already become, in scale and in urgency, unlike anything the United States has ever attempted before. Edwin Stanton, the same indispensable man who spent the night running the government from a stranger's front parlor, turns his formidable organizational energy almost immediately toward the pursuit. Within days, more than 10,000 Union troops are committed to the search, fanning out across southern Maryland and into Virginia, supported by detectives, informants, and a reward eventually totaling $50,000 for Booth alone, a staggering sum for the era, equivalent to something approaching $1 million in modern terms, the kind of bounty that transforms an already desperate fugitive into the most hunted man on the entire continent. Booth himself, in these first hours and days, is in considerably worse condition than the dramatic, theatrical figure who leapt from the presidential box only hours earlier. The fractured bone in his lower leg, adrenaline numbed in the chaotic moments immediately following the shooting, has by now announced itself in full, agonizing force, every mile of his desperate ride south through the Maryland night, a fresh exercise in pain that even a man of Booth's evident physical toughness finds difficult to fully suppress. He and his young accomplice David Herold, the same nervous, impressionable conspirator originally assigned to guide Lewis Powell to the Seward residence, link up sometime after midnight and continue together, Booth's leg deteriorating with every passing hour. Their first real stop comes in the pre-dawn hours, at the home of a country physician named Samuel Mudd, who sets and splints the fractured bone, a routine act of medical care for a stranger claiming to have fallen from his horse. The kind of small-town hospitality that rural doctors extended without much question in 1865, and an act that will, within weeks, place Mudd at the center of one of the most enduring and contested controversies of the entire affair. Did Mudd recognize his patient as the most wanted man in America, or did he genuinely believe, as he would insist for the rest of his life, that he was simply treating an injured stranger with no knowledge whatsoever of the catastrophe unfolding in Washington? The question would follow him to a military prison and, eventually, into the American language itself, his name lending itself, however unfairly, to a phrase about reputational ruin that persists to this day. From Mudd's house, the fugitives press on, moving with increasing difficulty through the soft, swampy backcountry of southern Maryland, territory Booth has, with characteristic foresight, spent months quietly cultivating contacts in, a network of Confederate sympathizers and underground couriers who have spent the war years smuggling agents and dispatches across the Potomac into Virginia. For nearly a week, Booth and Herold are sheltered in dense pine thickets near the river, hiding by day, venturing out only at night, sustained by food brought to them by sympathetic local contacts, while, just a few miles away, thousands of Union soldiers comb the same countryside, with growing, frustrated intensity. Booth, even in hiding, even in agony, even as the largest manhunt in American history closes in around him, keeps a small pocket diary, and what he writes in it during these days offers a remarkable, unsettling window into a mind still struggling to reconcile the magnitude of what he has done with the heroic self-image that drove him to do it. He had expected, by his own later writing, to be hailed as a hero throughout the South, a modern Brutus who struck down a tyrant in the name of liberty. Instead, the newspapers reaching him through his network of sympathizers describe him as a coward and a murderer, condemned even by many of the same Southern voices he believed he was acting on behalf of. He writes, with what reads now as genuine, wounded bewilderment, that he is here in despair, hunted like a dog, and that he does not understand why the very people he believed he was liberating have turned against him so completely. After nearly a week hiding along the Maryland shore, Booth and Herold finally attempt to cross the Potomac into Virginia, and even this crossing goes wrong on the first try, a navigational error in the dark, sending them upriver rather than across, forcing them to repeat the entire dangerous passage a second night before finally reaching Virginia soil. Once across, they continue moving south and east, guided in stages by a small relay of Confederate sympathizers, men whose own post-war fates will be shaped, often badly, by the simple fact of having offered shelter or directions to the nation's most wanted fugitive in the days immediately following the assassination. On the 24th of April, 10 days after the shooting, Booth and Herold arrive at the farm of Richard Garrett, a tobacco grower near the small Virginia settlement of Port Royal. Booth presents himself under a false name, a wounded Confederate soldier, he claims, recently injured at the siege of Petersburg and making his slow way home. The Garrett family, entirely unaware of the assassination or the manhunt consuming the rest of the country, extends the same unquestioning rural hospitality that has sustained the fugitives since the night of the shooting, offering them shelter in the farm's tobacco barn for what the Garretts believe will be a single uneventful night. It will be Booth's last. Federal cavalry, the 16th New York under Lieutenant Edward Doherty, guided by detectives who have been steadily tightening the net through careful, relentless investigative work, arrive at the Garrett farm in the deep hours before dawn on the 26th of April. They surround the tobacco barn. Herold, after a brief and confused exchange, surrenders almost immediately, emerging with his hands raised, his nerve like Atzeroth's before him, simply giving out under the pressure of the moment. Booth does not surrender. What follows in the hour before dawn has the strange theatrical quality of a final scene written and performed by a man who has spent his entire life performing dramatic final scenes for paying audiences, except that this time there is no script, no fellow actor feeding him lines, only a circle of armed soldiers and a barn, slowly filling with the dim grey light of an approaching sunrise. Booth, through gaps in the barn's wooden slats, negotiates and stalls and postures, at one point challenging his pursuers to an honourable open duel, at another asking simply for more time to consider his options. He admits in the course of this strange exchange that he is lame, confirming, for the soldiers still not entirely certain of his identity, that they have indeed cornered the right man. The soldiers, running short of patience as the night wears on, begin gathering kindling against the barn's outer wall. Booth, watching through the slats, warns young Garrett away from the task with a flash of his old, theatrical menace. But the threat changes nothing. The barn is set ablaze as flames begin to spread through the dry tobacco-curing structure. Booth is seen moving inside, lit by the growing firelight, a carbine visible in his hands. Sergeant Boston Corbett, watching through a gap in the barn wall, will later testify that he believed Booth was raising his weapon to fire on the surrounding soldiers. Corbett fires a single shot, without orders, in direct violation of the explicit instruction that Booth be taken alive for trial and interrogation. The bullet strikes Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. He is dragged from the burning barn, paralyzed but still alive, and laid out on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse as the structure behind him collapses into flame and ash. He lingers for nearly 3 hours, conscious for at least part of that time, able to speak only in a faint, struggling whisper. He asks at one point to see his own hands, and when they are raised before his fading eyes, he says only useless, useless, a final, bitterly ironic epitaph from a man whose entire identity had been built around dramatic, decisive physical action. His last coherent words, by the most widely accepted account, are a message for his mother. Tell her that I died for my country. He dies as the sun finally clears the horizon, 12 days, almost to the hour, after he fired a single shot into the back of Abraham Lincoln's skull in a darkened theater box in Washington. The manhunt that consumed those 12 days, the largest and most expensive pursuit of a single fugitive in American history to that point, is over. But the reckoning for everyone who helped Booth along his desperate path south, and for the small circle of conspirators who never fired a shot but who planned and prepared and waited alongside him, has only just begun. The reckoning. 8 people are arrested within days. Lewis Powell, who nearly killed Seward with his bare hands, David Herold, who guided Booth south for 12 desperate days. George Atzerodt, who lost his nerve in a hotel bar and never moved from his stool. And Mary Surratt, a 42-year-old widow who ran a Washington boarding house where the conspirators met and whose precise degree of knowledge remains genuinely disputed to this day. President Johnson orders them tried by military tribunal. A grieving nation, it turns out, wants certainty more than it wants due process. The trial runs 7 sweltering weeks through the summer. All 8 are convicted. 4 are sentenced to hang. On the 7th of July, in brutal midday heat, they are led into the prison yard. A crowd of nearly 1,000 watches in silence. Mary Surratt can barely stand without support. The hoods go on. The nooses go on. At 1:30, the trap doors open. She becomes the first woman ever executed by the federal government of the United States. Her son John, whose involvement ran considerably deeper than hers, had already fled. He surfaces 2 years later as a soldier in the Pope's personal guard in Rome, is extradited, tried and acquitted on a hung jury. He dies peacefully in 1916, having outlived his mother by 51 years. Booth is already dead by then. He died on a farmhouse porch in Virginia 12 days after the shooting, paralyzed, his last coherent words a request to see his own hands. When they were raised before his fading eyes, he said only, "Useless, useless." William Seward, his face permanently scarred, negotiates the purchase of Alaska 2 years later. Critics call it Seward's folly. He wears the scars for the rest of his life. Mary Lincoln never recovers. She does not attend her husband's funeral. She dies in 1882 in a darkened room in Springfield, the curtains drawn against the light. Ford's Theatre is seized by the government and never reopens as a theatre for nearly a century. In 1893, its upper floors collapse, killing 22 government clerks working inside. Today, the presidential box is preserved exactly as it appeared that night. The rocking chair is at the Smithsonian. The Peterson House still stands across the street, the bed still too short for a man of his height. The Garrett Farm in Virginia, where Booth died, lies beneath the lanes of a highway. A single roadside placard marks the spot. Most passing drivers never notice it, return for a moment to the laughter 10:15 on a Friday evening. A tired man in a rocking chair allowing himself, for the length of a single forgettable joke, to simply be happy. He had told his wife that afternoon that he intended to be happier in the years ahead. He believed, with every reasonable evidence available to him, that those years were just beginning. Lincoln did not die in the depths of the war's worst years. He died 5 days after the war's effective end, in a theatre box with his wife's hand in his, in the middle of a laugh. He had described his dream to the cabinet that same morning, the strange vessel moving with great speed toward a shore he could not quite make out. He had no way of knowing it would be the last time he described it to anyone. What the dream meant, only he might eventually have explained. That explanation never came. This has been Aphelion. Goodbye.